titled it, Is Your Faith This Strong? How strong is your faith? It's out of Daniel chapter 6, verses 6 through 18. Actually, it's 16 through 28, but it's actually all the way down to 1. The slide didn't get changed. I'm not going to read all the verses. I'm going to just cover some points on all of them. But slide number 1 says, will you be counted as faithful when everyone's against you? We live in a world today, maybe not as bad as it's going to be. I don't think it's as bad as it's going to be. But we live in a world today that the world's against us. The government's against us. People are against us. In Daniel 6, verse 1, and it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. Satraps are administrators. They're the governing bodies of the king. I always wondered what that word was, because you never hear it. But they're governing bodies for the king. And in our day, it would be like the governors, mayors, and state leaders. Okay? The local government, the state-by-state leader. In verse 2, Daniel 6:2, it says, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, and these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. And I accounted them with the Supreme Court, the House, and the Senate. Now, I'm just thinking of our government situation, how our country's run, and thinking about how our leadership in the world is. The satraps could also be the local judges, if you think of it that way. They chose 3 commissioners. But the verse says that Daniel had an extraordinary spirit. Maybe it's the verse 3, okay? Then Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. The king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Daniel was such a leader, Daniel was such a person in that time, that the king was willing to put him over the whole kingdom, to make him the whole entire kingdom. The 3 commissioners were the vice chairman and the commissioners and the administrators that answered to the king only. Daniel had an extraordinary spirit. He was a distinguished leader. He was one that was everybody in that time, before they made him a leader, everybody looked up to him. Everybody thought Daniel was it. Verse 4. It don't take long, does it? Verse 4, then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find ground of accusations against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence or corruption, as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. In other words, they wanted to get rid of him, but they couldn't get rid of him because he was a just guy, he was a faithful guy, and he had no corruption in his life. So what's that about? It's jealousy. Anytime somebody is put above someone else, anytime someone takes authority, especially if they're younger and they get put above somebody else, or especially sometimes if they're Christians and they get put over somebody else, people get jealous and start trying to knock them off the pedestal. They tried to ruin him. But even in all the times they were trying to ruin him, he kept being faithful. He never neglected Jesus. And I put there, it's like Jesus in the Gospels and us as believers. I think what we've gone through in the House of Representatives recently, okay, in the last, 3 years when we won the House, we started out with Kevin McCartney. Now, was he perfect? No. But what happened? Everybody went against him. One guy led the charge, and then they went against him. And then Jim Jordan, he never was actually made it at all, but he was the one that many people picked. And what'd they do? They stopped him before he was ever put in there, right? And then last of all, Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson was the one that got elected, and they've already started going after him. And Mike Johnson has taken a Christian stand throughout the whole thing. Now, is he 100% right on everything? No. But see, the coalition is what I'm trying to point to, is that time of history and today. 1 Peter 2:12 says, well, back up. We should be good as leaders, as believers. 1 Peter 2:12 says, keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, and they observe them and glorify God in the day of visitation. Philippians 2:15 says, all of us know this one, prove yourself to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as light to the world. Jesus is the light of the world, but He tells us to also be the light. Are you a leader? Are you a leader of Christian faith? Do we have leaders that live out their Christian faith, that try to push things on? And I'll even say pastors. Do we have pastors that have the Christian faith and will not back down? Now, some, I'm first to call out some that just absolutely get downright ugly when it comes to their faith, if it's something that they don't believe. And I call them out. We will not find fault against Daniel unless it is against God. Oh, I didn't read that verse. Daniel 6:5. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of God. What do they try to do now? If you start trying to preach the gospel, you start living the 10 Commandments, you speak out against abortion, you speak out against other things that are going on, what do? They attack you. Transgender, they attack you for speaking out against that stuff. And they will try to destroy you. They'll try to destroy the church. They try to destroy the cause of God. Daniel was upright, and they couldn't find anything. What's right is wrong, what's wrong is right in the world today. Acts 2:24. But this I admit to you, that according to the way, what was the way? That was what first believers, one of the things the first believers were called, which they call a sect. I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and is written in the prophets. I also do my best to maintain always blameless conscience, both before God and before men, or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they have found when I stood before the council. Do we I listened to this verse made me think about. I listened to a interview with Mike Johnson on the phone, on the TV, and Mike Johnson, 100%, the whole interview was about his faith. And he says, I pray every time. I pray daily. I pray all the time. And he said, sometimes I make mistakes. But when I make those mistakes, I own up to them. But I seek God on every decision I make. So what are they doing? They're trying to get rid of him because of that. When you are in authority, God's power and your friends, your counterparts are against you, will you stand? Are you going to stand firm when the world comes against you? What happens at the end times if we live through the end times? What's going to happen? Are you going to stand? Are you going to be one of those that buckles just a little bit? A little bit might as well be the whole thing, right? In my opinion. Okay? Daniel 6 through 9. And I'm only going to read part of it. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, and the satraps, and the high officials, and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute. What were they trying to do? They was trying to pump that king up. They was trying to say, "Oh, king," and that's part of the first part of that verse. "Oh, king, live forever." But they're trying to consult together to establish a statute to enforce that anyone that makes petition to any gods besides you, pumping them up again. Hey, you're here, king. You're here, O Darius. You're the greatest man alive. You need to be worshipped. And it says, anyone who makes petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days will be cast into the den of lions. So what did the king do? He liked that power. He liked the authority that was being given to him. Sort of like what happens when you get in the presidency or Congress or Senate or anything. They like that power. And I wrote in here too, I can get used to that power. I can get used to that money coming in. I can get used for all my expenses being paid. I can get used to writing these bills to cover stuff for my state, because if I'm good enough in my state, I'll get reelected. That's what happens in the world today. So what'd they do? He issued a decree that no one turns or kneels to any god or man besides the king. And what happened? I'll throw you in the lion's den. I'll throw you in the lion's den. Next slide, Tyler. Now Daniel knew the document was signed. It didn't cause him to waver one bit. And he entered in his house. Now his roof chamber, he had windows opened. In other words, he was not ashamed. He wasn't ashamed. He opened them windows and he continued kneeling and praying on his knees 3 times a day. We can't even get people to stand out and pray at football games. We can't get people to do anything. No. We can't get people to pray in restaurants a lot of times. No. So they continued to pray 3 times a day, giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. In other words, Daniel was not wavered. Daniel didn't care. Daniel was going to serve God because who's the authority? God is the ultimate authority. Yes. So Daniel continued to worship. Why don't we stand? Think about COVID. We stood here. But how many churches that we know closed during COVID? And what happens when that happens? Now people get used to watching TV in their pajamas and drinking their coffee. And they don't come back to church. Church attendance is still down in many churches because they never came back. Philippians 4:6 says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God." I just sort of believe that Daniel was praying, God, you know what's getting ready to happen. You know where I'm at. You know what I'm going to do. I'm going to be faithful. God, it's in your hands. I just believe Daniel said that. And that leads to 1 Thessalonians 5:17 and 18. Pray without ceasing. What that means, in everything give prayer. I always tell people, pray driving down the road. That's what pray without ceasing. You don't have to close your eyes to pray. Always have a continual attitude of prayer. In everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. God's will was for Daniel to go into the lion's den so God could be magnified. God will use those things that happen to you in your life as long as you stand for Christ, as long as you don't back down. God will use those things in your life. Daniel 6:16 and 17. Is that slide? Am I on the right page still back here, Tyler? Then the king gave orders to Daniel, was brought to cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. That tells me that Darius has some form of belief. But guess what? He wavered. He gave in. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of the nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. In other words, he threw him in the den. He threw him in there with the lions. He put his seal on there, which meant nobody could break that seal. And he did what he didn't want to do, but what he had agreed to do. He got trapped. We sometimes get trapped. But the key to that whole thing was, to me, was the king did his duty, but he believed God would deliver him. Now think about that one. I hadn't thought of that before. The king had watched Daniel and Daniel's life, and the king had some form of belief in God. 2 Corinthians 1, 9 through 10. We had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivers us from a great peril of death, and will deliver us. He on whom we have sent our hope, and He will deliver us. It doesn't matter what happens in the world today, God's going to take care of His children. We might have to suffer. We might have to go through some bad times. But God is still on the throne, and God will overcome. And we will overcome because of God in our life. An interesting part about that seal, if you think back to Matthew chapter 27, verse 66, they set a seal on the stone of Jesus' crucifixion. So it could not be opened. We didn't wait for man to open it, did we? The angel did. Daniel 6, 18 and 19. This is again is something that I have never, I've taught the book, not the book Daniel, I've taught the thing on Daniel before, Daniel and the lion's den, but I never got this much detail in it. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting. No entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled him. In other words, he was miserable. He was miserable because even though he did what he was supposed to, because he signed it, he was miserable because he went against God. He went against Daniel. We sometimes also get miserable when we don't do what God tells us to do. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. In other words, he couldn't wait to get down there and check on Daniel. But the next verse is even a little bit more worrisome to me. Just a little bit, not much, but a little bit. Daniel 6:20. When he had come to the den, near the den of Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. Got that? Troubled. Are you still there, Daniel? Did you make it, Daniel? Did God really protect you like we knew He would protect you? Maybe I don't have that much faith in God. That's what that verse is saying. He was troubled. He wasn't 100% sure because he had faith, but his faith was not strong yet. Yes. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you constantly serve, another question mark, been able to deliver you from the lions? See 2 question marks in that one verse? They didn't know if Daniel was going to survive. He didn't know if Daniel, just like the fiery furnace, just like Christ on the cross, He arose on the 3rd day. God delivered him. God will deliver us. God delivered so many in the Bible. Daniel 6:21. Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. Daniel's faith wasn't faltered, and Daniel still respected the king. He still respected him. He knew that he was trapped. He knew that he got caught up in a bad situation. How did he get caught up in that? Lack of prayer, lack of trust in God, lack of faithfulness. Have we been there before? I have. I've been there. Have you? Then the king gave orders and brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them and their children and their wives into the den, and they had not reached the bottom before the lions attacked them. I can imagine throwing them in there, and they're falling, and the lions are jumping up and getting them. Lions, I guess they were hungry, weren't they? They had sinned against God, and it cost them their families. In the world today, we have families that have sinned against God. And those families follow many times in the footsteps of those families. It's important to live that life, to have that Christian witness, to live the life that God's called us to live. And then Daniel wrote a decree, and I'm going to read the decree. Or Darius wrote a decree. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, men of every language who were living in the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. I looked, when I saw that verse, I thought about Luke 1:33. It's the birth of Christ. And that says at the birth of Christ, it says, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever and ever, and his kingdom will have no end. And then in Matthew 28:18, then Jesus spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and in earth. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who also has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions, so that Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus and Persia. Last slide, Tyler. I might have skipped that one, I don't know. Slide number 4, there you go. Although this is not a direct picture of the end times, we know in the world today that believers are persecuted and mocked and even sometimes thrown in jail for their faith and even put to death in other countries. I don't know of anybody in America that's been put to death for their faith, but I know people in other countries that have been put to death for their faith. This is a picture of the faithfulness of God, faithfulness and God's protection. I can't say that God will not allow you or me to be put to death. Jesus Christ died for all of us. And our sins, yours and mine. But as children of God, we are to be faithful in our life, our witness, our attitude, our actions, and our character. Just like Daniel, he was faithful. He lost something for a moment in 24 hours. 24 hours. But he gained much more of earth. And even better, he gained eternity. Think about it. That's what we're striving for, is our eternal home, not our earthly home. And then God gave me this verse, and I'm going to close with this verse if I can find it. I wrote it down, but I can't read it. Can't read my writing. Move this. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. For it is time for the judgment to begin in the household of God, and if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, those who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to the faithful Creator and doing what is right. We are to do what's right. We are to stand for God in triumph and in tribulation. No matter what happens in the world today, it's our duty as followers of Christ to stand for God. And sometimes it gets difficult. Sometimes when the world comes against you, it gets real difficult. But we're on the winning team. And that's all we have to remember. We're on the winning team.